must begin by saying Happy St. Joseph's Day, especially to our sisters. Welcome to Elms College. My name is Dr. Michael McGravy. I am an Associate Professor of Religious Studies and the Director of the Institute for Theology and Pastoral Studies here at Elms. Alongside my partners from the St. Augustine Center for Ethics, Religion, and Culture, I am so pleased to welcome all of you to this semester's joint Father Hugh Crean and Mary Dooley lecture. Tonight, we are honored to host journalist and author Christopher White, whose recent book on Pope Leo XIV takes readers from the Pope's childhood on Chicago's South Side to his missionary years in Peru, and ultimately to the 2025 conclave that elected the first North American Pope. White's work opens a window onto a church wrestling with questions of faith, leadership, economic justice, and global responsibility in our own time, making his insights especially timely for all of us gathered here. To begin, please welcome to the stage Father Mark Stelzer, Professor of Humanities, College Chaplain, and Special Assistant to the President for Catholic Identity. Father Stelzer will offer tonight's opening prayer.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. My friends, today we come together and all are very delighted to welcome Christopher White to Western Massachusetts and here to our campus. And at the same time, we come together to celebrate the life and the legacy and the lessons of two individuals I, along with many of you, were privileged to call a mentor, a colleague, and a friend. On this feast of St. Joseph, we remember two visionaries, Father Hugh Crean and Sister Mary Dooley, who, following doctoral studies in Europe, made it their life's work to implement the theological and the pastoral agenda of that watershed council. Sister Mary was a visionary leader, a distinguished scholar, and a beloved member of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Springfield for 70 years. Sister Mary's impact on Western Massachusetts and the national landscape was profound. A Renaissance woman with a PhD in French literature from the Sorbonne, she dedicated her entire life to education and to service. Sister Mary Dooley's leadership was marked by three pivotal presidencies. The presidency of her own religious congregation, represented so well here tonight, the presidency of the Leadership Council of Women Religious, and the presidency of the College of Our Lady of the Elms. During her tenure at Elms College, Mingling Mary, as she was affectionately known by her own sisters, broke down the silos so prevalent in academia. She helped all of us privileged to serve with her become aware of our interdependence and shared responsibility to instill in our students an appreciation of the rich Catholic intellectual tradition and Vatican II's clarion call to serve the neediest living beyond the gates of the campus, gates and fences that she literally tore down during her presidency. While still president of Elms College, Sister Mary, along with her own sister, Sister Eleanor Dooley, and the faculty of the Weston Jesuit School of Theology, established this lecture series, now named in her honor, a series specifically intended to explore what Sister Mary often referred to as the unfinished agenda of Vatican II. Father Hugh Crean, whose lecture series we also mark tonight, was a parish priest whose 53 years of ministry left an indelible mark on the Diocese of Springfield and beyond. A native of Westfield, Massachusetts, Father Crean's priesthood was defined by a unique blend of profound scholarship and heartfelt pastoral care. We are so thankful to Jack and Colette Dill here with us today for endowing this lecture series in his honor. Earning his doctorate from the University of Louvain, Father Crean shared his deep understanding of the faith and the intricacies of the new theology emerging from Vatican II by teaching here at Elms College and directing well over 100 retreats for priests across North America and beyond. A confidant and an advisor to 4 bishops and a dedicated trustee of this college, Father Crean thought strategically, yet spoke with a poet's heart. Despite his many accomplishments, Father Crean found his greatest joy serving the people in parishes like Sacred Heart in Springfield, Holy Name in Springfield, St. Michael's in East Longmeadow, and Our Lady of the Blessed Sacrament in Westfield. He lived with infinite compassion and an infectious laugh, touching all who knew him. As many of you here know, I had the privilege of living with Father Crean as a seminarian, as a traditional deacon, and later as a priest teaching at the college in Springfield. It was Father Crean who encouraged Sister Mary Dooley to invite me to join the adjunct faculty nearly 40 years ago. A few years later, it was Father Crean and Sister Mary who called, who wrote, who pestered, and even stalked Bishop McGuire until he finally released me for doctoral studies in theology at the Catholic University of America in Washington. Like so many of you here tonight, my gratitude to Hugh and Mary is profound and everlasting. How wonderful that the love these charismatic leaders share for the Elms and our dear neighbor continues to inspire those who have followed them, including our own Dr. Dumais, the 11th president of the College of the Elms, who will have the privilege of introducing our speaker. Prior to joining Elms College, Dr. Dumais served as Senior Vice President for Finance and Chief Financial Officer at St. Anselm's College, as Chief Financial Officer and Associate Dean for Finance and Information Technology at the Paulson School of Engineering and Applied Sciences at Harvard, and then in various leader positions in finance and administration, both at Boston College and Boston University. President Dumais received a BS degree magna cum laude in mechanical technology from Lincoln University, an MA in public administration from Framingham State University, an MBA and a graduate certificate in corporate finance from Boston University, and a PhD in higher education administration from Boston College. Dr. Dumais has consulted internationally on projects related to higher education and economic development with organizations in Europe and the Caribbean, and has served as a board member for the Council of Independent Colleges. He is a past commissioner and treasurer for the New England Commission on Higher Education and a committee member of NECHI's annual report on finance and administration. President Dumais also serves as a board member, a treasurer, and a member of the executive committee for the Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph, in addition to several other boards. So as we pray tonight for the intercession of Mary Dooley and Hugh Crean, as we pray for the intercession of St. Joseph, please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Harry Dumais, a mentor and a colleague and a friend to me and so many in this room tonight. Harry.
Thank you, Father Mark, for the introduction. How truly blessed are we to have the ultimate authority on both Reverend Hugh Crean and Sister Mary Dooley, who literally wrote the book about both of them, to do the opening this evening. Please let's give Father Mark another round. And please also join me in thanking Dr. Michael McGravy, Director of the Institute for Theology and Pastoral Studies and Associate Professor at Elms College, as well as Annette Ziomek in the back for really organizing this lecture series. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Oh, that's a good response. Welcome to Elms College for the 2026 Reverend Hugh Crean and Sister Mary Dooley combined lecture. It is quite fitting, as Father Mark says, on this Feast of St. Joseph, that we honor two storied members of the nearly 100 years old Elms College and their significant and enduring contributions to our community. And it is truly, truly wonderful to see so many of you here this evening for this distinguished lecture. Before I begin, I'd like to recognize some of the members and some of our guests in the audience. As Father Mark indicated, the Reverend Hugh Crean Lecture is made possible each year by an endowment set up through the generosity of Elms trustee Jack Dill and his wife Colette Dill. They envisioned the lecture to honor the legacy and lasting impacts of Father Hugh Crean. So thank you, Jack and Colette, for the gift of your presence, in addition to your financial support. I'd like to recognize the other past and present members of the Board of Trustees who are here with us. I don't know if I've seen Sister Betsy Sullivan. The members of the Board of Trustees, Dr. Cheryl Stanley, who's here, Sister Jane Thomas, Sister Eleanor Spring, Sister Maxine Schneider, and if there's anybody else that I missed, it's the light in my face. Also, several Sisters of St. Joseph who are here with us this evening. Thank you for being here. Someone who's always more popular than me on the Elms College campus, my lovely wife, Maggie. Thank you to Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Joyce Hampton. All members of the cabinet, the deans, the faculty, and staff who are here, it is on their behalf that I welcome you and say thank you to everyone for being with us this evening. Sister Mary Dooley and Father Hugh Crean were both scholars with a formidable intellect and an ongoing interest in Catholic theology and Catholic life. The lecture series that bear their respective names and which are combined this evening have each sought to honor these intellectual and pastoral gifts with which both Sister Mary and Father Hugh Crean blessed the Elms community during their times with us. And thus, since their creation, the Crean and Dooley lectures have each brought different thought leaders to our campus to discuss a broad range of topics, including spirituality, ethics, the richness of the Catholic intellectual tradition, and the future of faith in an increasingly technology-driven world. And this brings us to our speaker, who is uniquely positioned to discuss each, and I mean each, of these topics. Christopher White is the Associate Director for Strategic Initiatives and Senior Fellow of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. He is a former Vatican correspondent and national correspondent for National Catholic Reporter, an independent publication for journalism rooted in Catholic social teaching and promoting social justice and human dignity, and Crux, an independent news source on Catholicism and the Vatican. Christopher's work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Washington Post, and other publications. He has regularly appeared on US and international network news programs to discuss Vatican-related news. He was a featured speaker at the January Council of the Independent Colleges President Institute. In 2026, his book, Pope Leo XIV, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy, was published by Loyola Press. The book draws upon Dr. White's background as a Vatican reporter and analyst to paint one of the first comprehensive pictures of Pope Leo, the first American pontiff, and the potential impact of his leadership on Catholicism and its engagement with pressing global issues in a rapidly changing world. It is clear that there is deep international interest in the first American Pope. The fictional movie Conclave generated another type of interest in the process through which the Catholic Church designates the successor of St. Peter. But as a Haitian American, I'm particularly interested in the new Pope, his story and his views, given that genealogy confirms the Pope's maternal grandparents were part of a Creole family with roots in Haiti, which later migrated from New Orleans to Chicago. So we are delighted that Christopher White is with us to share some of the insights that he gained through some incredible journalistic and analytic work. So please join me in welcoming Christopher White to our campus.
Good evening. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for having me. I want to thank all of the organizers, but especially Professor Mike McGravy, Peter DePergola, and of course Dr. Dumais. It's a great honor. But you've set the bar too high this evening, so I want to, I guess, begin with a disclaimer. I'm not a theologian. I'm certainly not a priest. So I come to all of this as just a journalist, as a reporter, who lived in Rome for the last 4 years, covering the final chapter of Pope Francis's papacy and the conclave, and I moved back to the States in July. In preparing for tonight, some of the advertisements I noticed promised that this would be an insider's account of the conclave and the election of Pope Leo. I guess I should offer another disclaimer. I was not inside the Sistine Chapel when he was elected. And in the days after, one of the things that I spent my time doing was chasing cardinals around Rome to get them to tell me what happened inside the Sistine Chapel. And to varying degrees of success. But when you approach a cardinal to say what happened inside the Sistine Chapel, one of the first things that they will tell you is that it was the work of the Holy Spirit. And that's all that they'll initially want to say. And I heard that line over and over again. It was the work of the Holy Spirit. And it certainly was. But it reminded me, as I heard it on repeat, of a joke that's often told in Rome. And it goes something like this. There are various sort of formulations of it, but the general joke is that the Holy Trinity had won a free trip, and they had to decide where to go. And God the Father was asked where he wanted to go, and he said, I want to go to Africa. Jesus was asked where he'd like to go, and he said, I want to go to Palestine. And the Holy Spirit was asked where they'd like to go, and said, I want to go to Rome. And they kind of looked at him and said, why Rome? The Holy Spirit responded, it's because I've never been there. It's a joke. Despite the cardinal saying that the Holy Spirit was at work, that's very much true. I very much believe that. But of course, the conclave does have many human and political dimensions to it, and I'll talk about them tonight. It's a very strange thing that a conclave in this year, in 2025, is something that takes place where the entire world watches a chimney, and we rely on smoke signals to tell us what's happening in the most secretive election on Earth. And sometimes those smoke signals are interrupted by seagulls that begin to dominate all the attention on the camera. We're here now in Lent, but I want to begin by taking us back last year to last Easter. In fact, Easter Monday, April 21st. I'd gotten up early that morning on Easter Monday to go for a run along the Tiber in Rome. And I was so happy to have a chance to kind of clear my head after what had been a very strange Holy Week. Holy Week is always the most busy time of the year around the Vatican. But this one was not only busy, it was strange because for the most part, the Pope wasn't present. As many of you will recall, on February 21st, Pope Francis February 14th, Pope Francis entered Rome's Gemelli Hospital due to this lingering bronchitis affection that he'd been battling really since December of 24. And from that period on February 14th until Easter, it kind of felt a bit like Groundhog Day at the Vatican. To sort of walk you through sort of the life of a reporter, our days sort of began at around 8 a.m. where we would get a simple text message from the Vatican's press office. And the text message basically said something like, the Pope rested well, the Pope is now having breakfast. And it was effectively a message, a one-line message, just simply to convey to the world that the Pope was still alive. And that was, we were waiting for that message every morning. And then we would have to wait until about noon each day when the Vatican's press officer would come and meet with the journalists around the Vatican to sort of give us a broad sense of what the Pope's doctors were doing that day and discussing. And then that evening we would get a full medical readout from his doctors that gave a better sense of his clinical condition. And that was around 8 o'clock at night, and I'd quickly write a story and sometimes do media, and then prepare to do it all over the next day. And again, it felt like Groundhog Day for a few weeks there. Pope Francis was discharged from hospital on March 23rd, and we began to breathe a sigh of relief. His doctors said they expected him to make a full recovery. The Vatican even began to proceed with plans for a possible trip to Turkey to late May. And the Pope, despite being told to take it easy, began making surprise appearances. He first showed up in St. Peter's Square at the end of the Mass, and then he started having his assistants take him into St. Peter's Basilica, where he'd pass out candy to children that were there as tourists. So imagine that, you're in St. Peter's Basilica as a tourist, and the Pope is in there praying, giving out candy. It was pretty remarkable, but it was also something that kept reporters on edge, because you just never know what was going to happen next with the Pope. And we all were, of course, excited because the Pope was back in action. And yet at the same time, we were a bit worried because his doctors had said, you need to be keeping a low profile during this period of recovery. On the whole, though, it seemed things were improving. And then Easter Sunday came around. That morning, he met with Vice President J.D. Vance, who was in Rome. And they had a very short but quick meeting. And then he managed to make it out to the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, you can see here, where he gave the traditional Urbi et Orbi blessing to Rome and to the city and the world. And then he did something even more surprising, which is he got in the Pope-mobile and went around St. Peter's Square. And none of us had anticipated that. And it was this stark contrast of seeing this Pope who we had all covered up close for such a long time, who was just so much animated by being close to the people, back in his element, back with the people. But he didn't look great that day. I watched him and I thought, this is a man who is doing everything he can to be a pastor, and yet he is struggling. You could just see the pain on his face. His voice was raspy when he spoke, and when he made it through the square, there was a certain point where you could just see that he was aching with pain, and one of his aides was massaging his shoulders as he was out among the people. That evening, I was at an Easter gathering, and I asked a senior Vatican official, I said, I have to be honest, the Pope didn't look so good today. And he said, the Pope's having good days and bad days in his recovery, but today was a bad day, but we're still positive about his trajectory. That sort of scene played over and over again in my mind on the morning of the 21st, on Easter Monday. But selfishly, I kind of wanted to lean into the good narrative that the Pope was recovering. I was due to head back to the States at the end of the month to return home and to start new work at Georgetown. And so that morning I was on a run, kind of distracting myself with all of my favorite restaurants in Rome that I wanted to be sure to visit before I moved. And then I was prepared to enjoy Easter Monday, Pasquetta as it's called in Italy. It's a little Easter. It's a national holiday. And I was going away to the countryside with some friends of mine to have lunch, that we were all just exhausted after covering the Pope for his hospitalization over the last 2 months. And we wanted time to go out of town, and we were about to go to an area of Italy where we wouldn't have had cell reception, so that would have been a really bad idea. Then, at around a little after 9, I received another unexpected chime on my phone. It was from the Vatican press office, simply saying that in a few moments there would be a presentation from the chapel of Santa Marta. Santa Marta is the Vatican guest house where Pope Francis had resided since he was elected in 2013. We all started wondering, what might this be? There were no official appointments on the calendar. I personally thought perhaps the Pope was going to resign. I had seen his condition the next day, the day before, and I think many of us had thought during his hospitalization that resignation was an active possibility. But then I switched on the live feed, and before I could even hear the sound, before they began speaking, the grim expressions on the faces of these 4 prelates that were tasked with sharing the news of the Pope's death told the story of what had happened before I could even hear the official words. Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who you'll see at the microphone in this photo, began the announcement of the Pope's death by telling the world that Francis had returned to the house of the Father. He said, quote, "His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his church. He taught us to live the values of the gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially in favor of the poorest and the most marginalized." I was on the other side of Rome with another journalist friend of mine, preparing to go out of town, but instead I jumped on the back of his motorino, and we raced back to the Vatican, and I thought at certain points on that journey that I might soon suffer the same fate as Pope Francis. Roman traffic is a very serious business. And we arrived, and that set in motion what was the busiest month of my life, and certainly the most meaningful as well. I think many Americans are used to hearing the phrase that this next presidential election is the most important in the history of our country. We often hear that sort of said on the news. I don't think that can exactly be said of papal elections that go back for 2 millennia. But before the 133 cardinals entered into the Sistine Chapel on May 7th, several of the cardinals had told me that they believed the conclave of 2025 would be the most important in at least 60 years. I began my book, Pope Leo XIV, very simple and memorable title, with the comparison to the Second Vatican Council and Pope John XXIII's death of stomach cancer on June 3rd of 1963. Just 1 year earlier, Pope John had presided over the opening of the Second Vatican Council, a landmark event in the history of our church. The council promised to open up the church to the modern world. To give this ambitious project context, let me just share a few things that were happening in the world at that time. The war in Vietnam had been grinding on for nearly a decade at that point. Martin Luther King was leading the crusade for civil rights in this country, and the threat of nuclear destruction loomed large. The church and its leaders were really wrestling with the existential questions of what role the church was to play in a very rapidly changing world. When the council was announced on January 25th, 1959, the news sent shockwaves around Rome and in fact in the entire Catholic world. Councils are pretty rare in the life of the church, and at the time of what would become called Vatican II, there had only been 20 previous councils, each of them marked with great promise and also great trepidation, depending on who you spoke with. Speaking to the nearly 2,500 bishops from all over the world at the start of the council in 1962, Pope John said that it was time for the church to, quote, "look to the present, to the new conditions and new forms of life introduced into the modern world, which have opened up new avenues to the Catholic apostolate." While many of the past councils had been inward-looking, often concerned with focusing on suppressing potential heresies that had arisen in Catholic life, Vatican II was decidedly outward-looking. One observer wrote this at the end of the first session, quote, "I hadn't realized that anything like this existed. I thought the Roman Catholic Church was a very closed, complacent, and sectarian body that had nothing to learn from anyone else. Now I know this is no longer accurate, if it ever was. The whole atmosphere is so different. What is happening here is a real miracle. All of that was at stake when Pope John died in the summer of 1963. The question was, would the cardinals elect a new pope who would continue with the reforms initiated and set in motion by the council, or would they reverse course, afraid of the possibility that decades of Catholic tradition could be undone? When the conclave of 1963 began, the headline of the New York Times declared that, quote, "In modern times, there has never been a papal election so important as the one that starts in Rome tomorrow." Now, on June 21st, 1963, when Giovanni Battista Montini emerged from that conclave and he took the name Paul VI, it sent a signal that the reforms set in motion by Pope John XXIII would continue. The former Cardinal of Milan had been an ally of Pope John XXIII, yet they were very different in disposition. John XXIII had a winsome, somewhat extroverted personality compared to Montini, Pope Paul VI, who was more somber and contemplative. Yet Montini had been deeply engaged and invested and backed the first session of the council. Despite his support of the larger project, he also knew that the council would lead to a reckoning for the entire global institution. In fact, the night the council was first announced, Cardinal Montini called a friend of his and is said to have said of Pope John XXIII, quote, "This holy old boy doesn't realize what a hornet's nest he's stirring up." By the end of Pope Francis's papacy, some of the Pope's own cardinals had begun to characterize his papacy in similar terms, sometimes even using more pointed descriptions. There was Australian Cardinal George Pell, who, before his own death in 2023, penned a secret memo that had labeled the Francis papacy a catastrophe, and he was actively promoting candidates who would bring back an era of law and order to the Vatican's governance. There was Cardinal Gerhard Müller, the former head of the Vatican's doctrinal office, a German cardinal who went even further in his criticism of Pope Francis, who had implied that Francis had even drifted into heresy for allowing priests to offer blessings to couples in same-sex unions. I would argue, however, that the Francis papacy could be seen 50 years later as trying to implement the reforms of the council initiated by his predecessors, both John XXIII and Paul VI, and both of whom he went on to canonize during his own papacy. The Second Vatican Council had unleashed tremendous change in the life of the Church. Among its landmark reforms were the greater participation of laity in the Catholic life, the start of a new era in the Church's relationship with other religions, and a deepened commitment to religious liberty and pluralism. The Council explicitly called for a style of governance that was meant to be more collegial. And above all, the Council committed the Church to be engaged and open to the world around it. Over the 50 years that followed, those initiatives had been somewhat sluggishly embraced. They were often met with internal resistance by those that had a narrow understanding of the Council's aims. Yet in his first major document as Pope in 2013, Francis turned to the Council and anchored his own papacy in its call for, quote, ecclesial conversion, marked by an openness to a constant self-renewal born of fidelity to Jesus Christ. In the 12 years that followed, Francis pursued that vision by radically reorienting the Church's priorities. He demonstrated this in many ways, just a few I'll list here, by insisting that the Church focus an equal commitment on the needs of migrants and refugees and those facing environmental disaster, by putting women into high-ranking positions of power in the Vatican for the first time ever, and by beginning to dismantle the papal court that had long defined the institution. And perhaps most importantly, he cemented his legacy by launching a global synod process that was meant to invite Catholics from around the world to begin to share their joys, their anxieties, and their hopes for the Church as the church sought new ways to listen to all of the members of the church. Outside of the church, these changes were largely greeted with a thunderous reception. Like Pope John XXIII, Francis was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 2013, and he was hailed as the People's Pope for his courage to change an institution often known to be archaic and antiquated. Inside the church, however, a hornet's nest had been rattled. This past May, when the cardinals gathered from around the world to elect his successor, they were effectively facing a referendum on, as they did 60 years earlier, on whether or not to continue down this path. Now, following the death of the Pope, cardinals, who it's their main job as a cardinal to elect a new Pope, they all began to descend into Rome. This was meant to be the largest and most diverse conclave in history, with over 70 countries represented. Over 80% of the men that headed into the Sistine Chapel had never participated in a conclave before. And so they had to use this time between the death of the Pope and the election of a new Pope to begin to get to know each other. But immediately the spotlight began to fall on a few leading candidates known as the papabile in Italian, potential popes. The first sort of front runner was Cardinal Parolin, an Italian cardinal who was Pope Francis's Secretary of State. He's still Pope Leo's Secretary of State. He was viewed as a very talented and capable diplomat who had served all around the world, most notably in Venezuela, and he knew most of the men heading into that conclave. And in a conclave where 80% of the men had never been in a conclave before, name recognition counted for a lot. Yet there was also a real strike against Cardinal Parolin. He'd spent his entire service in the church's diplomatic corps, and he lacked for many what they would consider to be real pastoral experience, working with the people of God in just a Catholic parish or a Catholic diocese. And many people thought that after a papacy that emphasized the need for pastors to be with the people of God, electing a pope that hadn't had any pastoral experience wouldn't be the best continuation of that. But he went into the conclave as the most, with serious name recognition and as the front runner, and many people viewed him as the candidate to beat. Then there was Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines. Cardinal Tagle was actually a front runner in the 2013 conclave as well. He'd been talked about, and over the years since then was referred to by many people as an Asian Pope Francis. They shared many of the same priorities, particularly known for a commitment to the poor and the marginalized. And if you've ever watched Cardinal Tagle, he gives talks and he always speaks from the heart, and he's quick to cry. And many people thought that he has a wonderful ability to connect with people. Other cardinals thought, because of that, he might get eaten alive by the Vatican's curia system, and its very complicated bureaucracy, and they thought perhaps he doesn't have the management backbone to withstand what some people would see as sort of a den of vipers, known as the Roman Curia. Then there was Cardinal Peter Erdu from Hungary. Cardinal Erdu was, I mentioned a few moments ago, Cardinal Pell, and him looking for a candidate of law and order. Cardinal Erdu is very much seen as the candidate for those looking for a course correction from Pope Francis. He has a background in canon law, and he was seen and he was promoted as someone who would bring law and order to an institution that needed it. Then there's Cardinal Mario Grech, who was the head of the Vatican Synod Office from Malta. And many people thought that this was a conclave in which synodality, Pope Francis' signature project, was this was a referendum on synodality. And if the cardinals wanted to continue down that path, who better to look at than the head of the Vatican Synod Office to carry on that vision? Then there was Cardinal Aveline from Marseille, France, who spent most of his childhood in Algeria and was really known as a passionate advocate for migrants. His name began to surface in the final days before the conclave, and some even said, he kind of looks like John the 23rd. He just looks like he could be Pope. And then there was someone else whose name began to surface. He wasn't on many people's short lists. His name was Cardinal Robert Prevost, but we'll talk about him in a minute. In 2022, when Cardinal Robert McElroy, who's now the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., When he received his red hat and made a cardinal, he was asked about the possibility of an American pope. A reporter said, "As cardinal, you will one day enter into the Sistine Chapel. You could become pope." Cardinal McElroy said, "I don't think an American should ever be pope. In fact, I would oppose an American being elected." He's since changed his mind. But what the cardinal was getting at was a widely shared perception among many of the College of Cardinals. The general thinking, and what Cardinal McElroy went on to say in that interview, was that the United States has too much power in the world, and if an American was elected to the papacy, that would only diminish the global perspective that the head of the world's 1.4 billion Catholics need in governing a universal church. McElroy's position was often heard in Rome, particularly by members of the College of Cardinals from the Global South, who viewed the idea of an American pope as diminishing and perhaps too big of a player on the world stage to have both the presidency and the papacy. In 1989, Pope Leo XIII even wrote a letter warning of the dangers of what he called Americanism, which is quite complicated, but it was a potential heresy expressed through an overzealous emphasis on the idea of individual liberty. Many of the cardinals were fearful of sort of the idea of an American, just in the days before a conclave, when President Donald Trump, just back to the US after attending Pope Francis's funeral, posted an AI image of himself on social media dressed as the Pope. The White House even shared that image on their official account, and then a reporter asked President Trump who he thought should be elected Pope. He responded, "I'd like to be." Then he said, "Actually, we have a cardinal out of a place in New York who's very good, so we'll see what happens." Now, with all due respect to Cardinal Dolan, who I know well, Cardinal Dolan is known as a backslapping, hot dog-loving guy. And that was kind of the caricature of what some cardinals feared, this sort of American-style pope that was larger than life and would suck up all the oxygen in the room. Despite having 3 non-Italian pontiffs in a row, a Pole, a German, and an Argentine, the conventional wisdom was that tapping someone from the world's largest superpower to lead the world's smallest state would just be a bridge too far. These, however, are unconventional times. On May 7th, the day the cardinals entered conclave, I published a piece in Foreign Policy magazine suggesting that precisely because of this new era, the idea of an American pope was gaining steam and attraction in Rome. Just weeks before the conclave, when Vice President Vance was in Rome at Easter, Cardinal Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, lamented in an interview that the United States no longer seems to be interested in engaging in the multilateralism that has long defined the Vatican's approach to foreign policy. In this interview with the Italian daily La Repubblica, he said, quote, "It is clear that the current administration's approach is very different from what we're used to and what we've relied on for many years." What I argued in the day the conclave began was that perhaps in this changing world order, fueled by increased isolationism and disregard for multinationalism, the Vatican was perhaps those inside the Sistine Chapel were interested in someone who was committed to those ideals. As the cardinals met in Rome for their closed-door meetings in the lead-up to the conclave, they discussed both the internal needs of the church, but also what was happening in the world outside of those rooms. They asked themselves, what sort of leader do we want to navigate this global realignment? That's when the name Cardinal Robert Prevost began to surface and reverberate around the room. Prevost, who was 69 at the time, had been brought to Rome to head the Vatican's powerful office that is effectively responsible for vetting potential bishops around the world. It has a clunky name known as the Dicastery for Bishops. That just basically means Department of Bishops. And Pope Francis had brought him there 2 years earlier to lead this influential office. He was Chicago-born, but he'd spent the bulk of his life in Peru. As the former head of the Augustinian religious order that operates in 50 countries around the globe, he had extensive experience and exposure among many of the world's cardinals responsible for electing the next pope. This is a photo I have here that I just got 2 weeks ago from someone I met who was with Cardinal Prevost when he was just Padre Roberto. You can see him at the center of the photo, and you can kind of see his playful personality. This is when he first arrived in Peru as a young missionary. And these young women were effectively the backbone of one of the local parishes that he was assigned. And they told me a great story, and they shared this photo with me, about how he was always staying late at night at the parish, and they were always worried that he wasn't getting enough to eat. And so they'd always bring him food. And one night, they had gone up to see him and help him out at the parish, but none of them had any food to offer him, and they were all hungry at the end of the night. And the only place open in this small town was a nightclub. And so at around 11 o'clock, Padre Roberto went with these 3 women of the parish to eat chicken at this local nightclub. And I share that story because this was sort of the unassuming personality that had arrived in Rome 2 years earlier when I first met him. He had arrived in Rome, brought over by Pope Francis from Peru to head a very powerful office, and yet he wasn't really known as a serious player on the Roman scene. He kept a low profile, and I think that was intentionally so. He wanted to shy away from the spotlight. He had spent much of his life outside of the United States, but even so, he was a polyglot, speaking 4 to 5 languages comfortably, which allowed him to communicate with almost all of the cardinals. Critically, he was deeply invested in what Pope Francis had called, quote, a better kind of politics, one that prioritizes the common good above and beyond everything else. Back in 2022, when Cardinal McElroy was discussing the prospects of an American pope, he noted that foreign travel often allows one to see different perspectives, and the world begins to look quite different from our American reference points, he said. He then added, quote, that doesn't mean our reference points are wrong, but it just means we need to have a wider perspective. That's what Cardinal Prevost brought to the table. Cardinals began to asking themselves, could someone from the United States take charge of the last absolute monarchy in the world? It was a counterintuitive idea. Others, however, thought that someone could use the bully pulpit of the papacy to counter other potential bullies on the world stage, and that could be a game changer. In an interview 2 years before he became Pope, Cardinal Prevost said that a Catholic bishop is, quote, not supposed to be a little prince sitting in his kingdom. Instead, he's called to walk authentically, to be humble, to be close with those whom he serves, to walk with them, and to suffer with them. In working on my book on the election of Pope Leo, many of the men who went to the Sistine Chapel told me that they believed this was the type of leadership that could draw a stark contrast that was being witnessed elsewhere in the world. The cardinals entered conclave on the afternoon of Wednesday, May 7th, and they began that morning with the special Mass of the Holy Spirit, and then they all went back to the Vatican guest house where they were residing. Now, the cardinals are shut off from the outside world in the conclave, meaning they have to surrender their phones and their computers. So when it was time for them to go into the Sistine Chapel that afternoon to take their oath and begin voting, after lunch, but beforehand, many of them took naps, yet they didn't have their phones, so many of them overslept. Nonetheless, they were gathered and they entered into the Sistine Chapel. They took their vows. They were offered a meditation by Father Cantalamessa, who was the papal preacher. It was supposed to be 15 minutes, but it was about nearly an hour. And then they cast their first ballots. And black smoke appeared at 9 p.m. instead of 7 p.m. when it was originally expected. The cardinals then went back to Santa Marta. They went to bed. Before they did so, the residents of the Vatican guest house passed out alarm clocks so that they wouldn't oversleep the next morning. The next day, they had a ballot in the morning, and we got white smoke just before lunch, and then the cardinals went back for another nap. That afternoon, though, when at around 4 o'clock, we began to get ready for what we were expecting to be another round of smoke. Would we have white smoke or black smoke? The past 2 conclaves, the voting had finished up on the second day. When the white smoke appeared on the afternoon of May 8th, I was on set with NBC and MSNBC on the rooftop of the Augustinianum, which was the headquarters of the Augustinian order, where coincidentally, Robert Prevost lived and worked for 10 years when he was the head of the order. Up until the day before they went into conclave, he still went there every single morning for Mass, and he returned there every day for lunch. Now, there's about an hour of time to fill between the time white smoke appears and the time a new pope appears on the balcony. It's a strange time because you know there's news that there's a new pope, but you don't know who it is. So the time is full of speculation, and adrenaline is running high. Who have the cardinals elected? One of the folks on set with me was Bishop Robert Barron. Many of you probably know him from his very popular Word on Fire ministries. He's the Bishop of Winona, Rochester in Minnesota. We were off camera, and he said to me that after a quick election, he thought that it had to be Cardinal Parolin who'd been elected. He then asked me who I thought it would be, and I said, I believe it's Cardinal Prevost. And then he laughed at me and dismissed the idea as a pure fantasy that only Vatican watchers could dream up in hopes of selling newspapers. I haven't heard back from him since then. But eventually, the moment happened that we'd all been waiting for. The Cardinal Deacon, Cardinal Memberti, appeared on the balcony, and he announced the words that we all have heard and been waiting for, Habemus Papam, we have a pope. Now, I'm lousy at Latin, but I'd been studying the first names of the leading candidates, and so when I heard the words Robertum Franciscum, I smiled and I felt a bit vindicated, thinking about my conversation with Bishop Barron earlier. And everyone began scrambling because many of them weren't sure who had been elected, especially those who didn't follow the Vatican day in and day out. And I screamed, "It's the American!" That's when everyone on set realized that history was being made. Yet, a few minutes later, there he was. No longer as Cardinal Prevost, the man who I'd gotten to know 2 years earlier, but as our new Pope, who had taken the name Pope Leo XIV, in reference to Pope Leo XIII, who founded modern Catholic social teaching. That night, he appeared on the balcony and he delivered a speech that he had handwritten very quickly right after he had been elected Pope. But in less than 500 words, Pope Leo gave us an early blueprint of what to expect in the years ahead. He used the word peace 9 times, indicating his desire for the Church to use its position to do anything it can to bring peace to a divided world, often as Pope Francis described as a World War III being fought in piecemeal. He said he wanted a church that is missionary, capable of building bridges and open to all. And when I heard that, I thought of Pope Francis's often used phrase, a church that is open to todos, 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 tutti, 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 everyone, everyone, everyone. And then he said the word itself. He said he wanted a church that was synodal. That was, in a sense, what the conclave had all been about, a referendum on synodality. In fact, the day Pope Francis was buried, Cardinal Ray, the Dean of the College of Cardinals, had delivered a beautiful homily on at Pope Francis's funeral, highlighting all of Pope Francis's major accomplishments. Yet never once did he mention the word synod. The British theologian Anna Rowland said that she believes there were 3 camps among the College of Cardinals. There was one camp who believed Pope Francis's pastoral priorities of outreach to the poor and marginalized were effective, but they had no interest in continuing his commitment to synodality and this new way of being church. There were others, a middle camp that she described as those who appreciated synodality as a form of missionary outreach, but not really as a constituent dimension or a new way of being church. And then there was a camp that she called the Avanti camp, using the Italian word to go forward. The question for this camp, she says, is how to bring the whole church along with it. The big challenge for the conclave was that the cardinals, without Francis there, had to convert each other to synodality without the Pope there as the enforcing figure, and they had to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to make this their own. When Pope Leo said he wanted a church that was synodal, I would suggest that the election of Leo was very evidently a victory for the Avanti camp. A few minutes after he was elected, I was on set with now Archbishop McKnight of Kansas City. You can see us there on set. And I was with him as Pope Leo began to talk and give that speech that evening. Coincidentally, Archbishop McKnight was just in Rome for pilgrimage with his diocese. And so he was called on to do media, and he stood next to me as Pope Leo began to speak. And I watched him, tears well up in his eyes, and at the end of his speech, he simply said, "Thank God Francis continues." A few days after the conclave, New York's Cardinal Dolan was asked about the significance of Pope Leo being from the United States. Here you see Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio meeting with Pope Leo after his inauguration. Cardinal Dolan said, "I don't think the fact that Cardinal Prevost is from the United States actually had much weight. It should not startle us that we should look to Pope Leo as a bridge builder. In fact, that's what the word pontiff means in Latin." He said, quote, "Will he want to build bridges with Donald Trump? I suppose so, but he would want to build bridges with the leader of every nation. I don't think at all that my brother cardinals would have thought of him as a counterweight to any one particular person." Cardinal McElroy, who I mentioned earlier, who previously sought to downplay the possibility of an American pope, admitted his surprise, and he said, quote, "I think the impact of him being an American was almost negligible to the deliberations of the conclave, surprisingly so for me." Cardinal Gregory, who was Cardinal McElroy's predecessor in Washington, and also a native son of Chicago, made reporters laugh when he said, "The conclave should not be seen as a continuation of the never-ending American political election cycle. It wasn't an election conclave," Gregory insisted. "It was simply a desire to strengthen the Christian faith among God's people." What might this mean for the future of the Leo papacy? How might he want to strengthen the Christian faith among all of God's people? I'd suggest that, like popes before him, he'll be deeply committed to putting the defense of human dignity at the center of his papacy, not as a matter of politics, because it's what the gospel requires. This will at times have political consequences, but he'll not be shy about using his voice to defend human dignity and promote the common good when necessary. For the most part, Pope Leo has shied away from spending too much time on commenting directly on matters in his home country. He's steering clear of being viewed as a soundbite machine, offering a stark contrast to others who can't seem to stop talking when the camera's in their face. In October, Pope Leo was asked about the situation facing migrants in the U.S., and he lamented their plight, and he called for, quote, "a deep reflection." A year into his papacy, some U.S. Catholics are still trying to figure out Pope Leo. There are those on the political right and the political left that are trying to examine every move to determine which side is this guy on. I would suggest, however, that if we take seriously his call for a deep reflection and listen to some of his own words, it's quite evident that Leo, like his predecessor, isn't really so much interested in perpetuating the U.S. culture wars as he is in trying to reorient the U.S. church toward the gospel. Pope Leo may have spent the majority of his life outside of the United States, but unfortunately it seems that there are those who don't want him to outrun the polarization that seems to have poisoned the church in his homeland at times. As Pope, he's now poised to remind us that the church's social teaching doesn't map well into our American political landscape. A Pope who opposes abortion and speaks out on behalf of migrants and victims of climate change will, in the words of one of his Augustinian confreres that I spoke with after the election, quote, "greatly please and occasionally disappoint conservatives and will greatly please and occasionally disappoint liberals." During his opening speech the night of his election, Leo said that he dreamed of a church united, quote, "searching all together for peace and justice, working together as women and men, faithful to Jesus Christ without fear, to be missionaries faithful to the gospel." In his Lenten message for this year, Pope Leo echoed a similar theme. He encouraged us to listen and fast from harsh words. He said, quote, "This year I would like for us to consider the importance making room for the word through listening. The willingness to listen is the first way we demonstrate our desire to enter into relationships. Dear friends, he said, let us ask for the grace of a Lent that leads us to a greater attentiveness to God and the least among us. Let us ask for the strength that comes from the type of fasting that also extends to our use of language, so that hurtful words may diminish and give way to greater space for the voice of others. Let us strive to make our communities places where the cry of those who suffer find welcome, and listening opens paths toward liberation, making us ready and eager to contribute to building a civilization of love. Father Donald O'Reilly, an Augustinian father in Pennsylvania who's known Leo for some time, said, listening, quote, that's the libretto. As an Augustinian, we kind of know the playbook. Pope Leo is giving us the foundation to talk to each other. I think that invitation is an opportunity that Leo, history's first pope from this country, is trying to offer the church and the world, to listen and talk to each other. Now we have to decide how we want to respond. So with that, I believe we'll begin our time of questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So if you do have a question, just raise your hand and we'll come about. All right?
How does a reporter who thinks of himself only as such learn to listen?
It's such a good question. I think I'm far more interested in asking questions than doing the talking, so let me add that. But it's, the synod process was quite interesting, and I'd have to say I learned a lot. It was educational for me, because for 4 years I got to cover the synod process up close, and if anyone in this room has participated in the synod process, you'll know that the entire sort of way of doing it was through conversations in the Spirit. And I'm not going to walk you through what that looked like, but it required round tables and everyone going through this period where each person had a chance to speak, and then silence was critical. And reporters don't often get the luxury of silence, but I would have to say the synod process certainly taught me a lot about trying to sort of enter into that space with those that were undergoing the whole synod journey in Rome, and I learned a lot from them. But I'd say it's a work in progress. And I'd say the biggest challenge reporters have as an occupational hazard is trying to write in your mind the article that you want to write, rather than the article that the person in front of you is preparing you to write through whatever they have to say. And that's an occupational hazard.
I guess first a comment. I heard about the genealogy of the Pope, American and Haitian.
Yes.
I'm sorry to tell you, my wife is Peruvian, and she's telling us that he is the Peruvian Pope.
Yes, if I can respond to that, I'll respond just on two fronts. A day or two after the conclave, I ran into this individual who I knew well that worked in my apartment building that I live in Rome. And we were talking in Italian, and I said, he said, oh, how was it with the conclave? And I said, well, it's been very busy because, Papa Americano. And I had forgotten that he was from Peru, and he said, Papa Peruviano. And I think he is being claimed as a Peruvian, as a South American, and I think that's a testament to his own biography and the universality of the church, and I think that's a great thing. So.
Now I have a comment and a question. I had the honor and the privilege in 1968 of being in Medellin when the Medellin document was being developed that defined, in effect, the theology of liberation.
Yes.
And I was there when the Pope, Paul, came to receive and bless the document. So I'm curious about this issue of kind of alliance with the theology of liberation by the current Pope. I guess you already implied that the comment about, Francis is continued. makes that very point. But my question is, how is this so-called alliance with the theology of liberation seen in the Catholic bureaucracy in Rome? Is that really well received by the conservative side of it, or is it being accepted? Is it being challenged?
That's a heavy question. I'd say a few things. One, I try to move past the sort of conservative liberal divide in answering that. You know, Cardinal Mueller, who I mentioned earlier, is the former head of the Vatican's doctrinal office. No one would accuse him of being a progressive, and yet he was a close friend and great supporter of Gustavo Gutierrez. And so I think certainly there was a flourishing in the Francis era of theologians where the theology of the global South was influencing the church more broadly, and certainly in Rome. And of course, Pope Francis, canonizing Romero was a watershed moment for that. I think for Prevost, what was most formative for him was not so much any particular text of theology. When he arrived in Peru for the first time in his 20s, he arrived in a missionary diocese that the Augustinians had been involved in helping to run for a long time. And the father, then bishop, that was in charge there had been at the council. And he came back to that area of Peru really sort of just alive and energized by the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. And what he saw there, what Prevost saw there in Peru, was a diocese where lay people were really counted on as sort of being co-responsible in the running and the life of the diocese. And the priests stood alongside the very poor and fought for their economic rights. And that, in his own words, is what made him a priest, that experience. So it wasn't a text or a school of thought, but it was an actual experience, but certainly one animated by those that had been at the council, and I think he certainly was a bit contagious for him as well.
Hi, thank you so much for your comments. My name is Anne Franzik, and I apologize in advance for the preface here, but I have a vested interest in this topic. My husband and I are the very proud parents of a gay son who came out at the age of 16 in 1998. And shortly after coming out, I became extremely involved in Catholic activism around the LGBT question. Locally under Monsignor Farland at Sacred Heart, and also Bishop Timothy McDonnell, and nationally under Fortunate Families and New Way Ministries with Sister Janine Gramick and Bernardino. And I'm just, it may be unfair to ask this question, but I'm just wondering if you could shed some light on what you think the disposition of Pope Leo might be around this question.
Sure.
Obviously, Francis opened the door by saying, "Who am I to judge?" And was very open about the idea of blessing civil marriages, not recognizing it as a sacrament, but civil marriages. My son is now married civilly and has a 9-year-old son, actually. I'm very proud of the whole situation. But I guess getting down to the nitty-gritty, my question would be if you would have any sense of how Leo would respond to a young man in a confessional who said that he is attracted to another man or two women, and whether or not he would embrace that relationship in all of its manifestations, or if he would embrace the more conservative line of courage, the group courage, and the whole notion of same-sex attraction and that sort of thing. Thank you.
That's an easy question. Let me try to say a few things. I don't want to begin to speculate about what the Pope may say or do, particularly in a confessional. I'll just tell a few stories, and I'll let the anecdote speak for themselves. Maybe 3 stories, 3 quick things. Cardinal Fernandez, the head of the Vatican's doctrinal office, has said since the election of Leo that Fiducia Supplicans, Francis's document that allowed priests to bless those in same-sex relationships, that still stands, and that's not being rolled back. And Cardinal Fernandez is a savvy individual, and he wouldn't have said that had he not discussed that with the Pope beforehand. I'm fairly confident of that. The second thing I would say is Pope Leo met with Father James Martin, who I'm sure many of you in this room are familiar with his own work through outreach. And Pope Leo said that his message to him was that he wanted to continue on the same path of welcome and openness initiated by Pope Francis. So I think that's the most direct thing we've heard from Pope Leo. The third thing I want to say is that during the Synod, there was the testimony of a young, I'm just trying to remember the specifics of this. You can go online and look for the specifics of it. I'm going to speak abstractly because I don't remember the specifics, but I believe it was a young woman whose sibling committed suicide after being rejected by her parents after coming out. And that was a pivotal moment in the Synod. It was a moment that was spoken about frequently and referenced. And I know that young woman was at then Cardinal Prevost's table at a certain point, and she has talked about what a positive experience she had talking with him about that. So that I share those stories as sort of what I'm aware of that has sort of shaped him in recent years. The final thing I'll say, I think I wrote this in the book, it's all a bit of a blur. You know, he gave an interview in 2011 or 2012 when he was asked, I don't remember specifically the question, but he said something about, he used the phrase, I think he said the gay lifestyle or something like that, and it was viewed by a lot of people as somewhat negative. And a reporter asked him about that in 2023 when he became a cardinal, and he said, one thing that I've learned in the Francis era is that it's challenged and helped me become more open and more welcoming. That's what he's had to say on it. I imagine, these are early days, this has been a year, he's going to get more direct questions put to him, and that's for him to navigate, so I don't want to put words in his mouth.
Thank you.
First off, amazing speech or presentation, thank you. So I had a question. I understand that Pope Benedict was one of the oldest selected popes at 78, and I think Francis was 76. Pope John Paul was a bit of an outlier at, I want to say, 58. When you were talking to the cardinals, did they talk about there being somewhat of a reticence to select a younger pope? And then Pope Leo was actually 69, which, well, it's increasingly seeming young to me. Is kind of a midway point, and quite a bit younger than perhaps most of us expected the next pope to be. And I was hoping you could.
Yeah, it's funny, talking to cardinals about the age is a delicate thing because it forces them to reflect on their own age. But it's a question that I would put to a lot of cardinals in the lead up to the election. Like, the standard questions: are you willing to look, outside of Europe? Those sort of questions. And what do you think is a fair age range? Because it's a job for life, and you kind of want to find the sweet spot. You want to give it to someone who has the energy to carry on and keep up with all the demands of a very taxing schedule. And yet, at the same time, you don't want them to be around forever, because it's a lifetime appointment. But people tend to think it's good to have new blood in there. I think the general consensus this time around was that the cardinals wanted someone who could get the job done. And what they wanted was someone who could, I think, the overwhelming majority of them, carry on the vision of Pope Francis, but do so in a more sort of systematic way that had the skills as a manager, as someone capable of governing, and that's where they found Leo, and the fact that his age was 69, now 70. For many of them, I thought it was something that they thought, okay, that's a good spot. He could be Pope for 20 years. Francis always governed as if he was, it felt often as if he was running out of time. Those are the words that he said. I mean, right after he was elected, Francis gave an interview where he said, 4 or 5 years and then I'm off to the Father's house. He ended up having a much longer papacy than I think he even envisioned. But because of that, he just operated at a breakneck speed. He didn't take any holidays. He was always just going. And I think with Leo, many of the cardinals are relieved to have someone who can, in a sense, take a step back, figure out what needs to be done in terms of really looking at the institution, both when it comes to synodality, but also issues like the Vatican finances, and figure out how do we best lead the church in the 21st century. And that is something that, I think he's well suited to do, and is pretty much the right age for that. And he's in great health. He's an active swimmer, and he takes off a day every week, and he swims and rides his horse. So he's determined to stay fit. So
There's time for one more.
After the conclave, did you find the cardinals reluctant to talk with you about their views?
not if I poured enough wine. No, I mean, so the book was pieced together from a number of interviews I did, both people that went on the record and others that would describe what happened, but without attribution. I think many of them feel as if it's important to preserve some element of secrecy. My dear friends and colleagues, Jerry O'Connell and Elizabeth B.K., they have a new book out that I think it's out this week or next week, and it gets into some of the later revelations. But I think many of them feel as if they are doing a balancing act of honoring their vows, but also providing some sort of record for history. And so they want to explain how we ended up here. And of course, for me, what was very important was to try to speak to a wide range of cardinals from different areas of the globe, because what was animating cardinals from this country might not have been what was animating cardinals from other places. And that was, I think, in order to tell the story of the election of Pope Leo, you have to kind of understand the many dynamics at play.
We can all appreciate Chris, but I just have to say I was a freshman at Gannon University, a small diocesan Catholic liberal arts in Erie, Pennsylvania, when Pope Benedict passed, and I dreamed of doing Chris's job, of reading on the Augustinian or the Gregorian, and having that audience to kind of analyze. But as a young theology major, I could dream, right? So first of all, thank you very much to Chris for sharing your time and your insights. Before we depart, please let me express my thanks to those who helped put this evening together. Special thanks to Annette Ziomek. She already dashed off to Little next. She worked tirelessly. We both talked about how little sleep we got this week to help arrange the lecture. To Dr. Damian Murray, Dr. Joyce Hampton, and Dr. Harry Dumais for their support and assistance as we welcome Christopher to campus. So thank you. And we're also grateful to you all for joining us here, for being a part of this conversation and presentation. Now, we're going to ask Chris to be available to sign some books that you might want to purchase. So we're going to usher him out. If you could give him a moment to find a table. There's still some refreshments there, and we welcome, again, the conversation to continue. So please, thank you again for joining us. All of you have a safe trip home. Thank you.